video is Year 8 Term 4 and it's all about the physical landscapes in the UK. Throughout this topic you're going to need to know these key terminology and you'll use these in your lesson, so it's a good idea to learn them. First word is landscape, and this is basically the visible features of an area of land, so what you can see. The second is uplands, so uplands are hilly areas or mountainous areas. Foreground, this is the part of the view that's at the front, so if you're looking out the window, what you can see close to you would be the foreground. Land use is what the land is used for, so some examples are farming or industry, or it could be residential or commercial use. The physical layer is like the base layer, and this is where rock and landscape processes have sculpted a physical landscape. Okay, so think of the work that with rivers and the weather does. The next layer is the biological layer, and this includes soil, plants, trees. And finally, the one that we tend to have biggest impact on is the human layer. Okay, so it includes settlements, e.g. cities, communications, roads and farming. Now, if we take a landscape and we split it into these three distinctive layers, we can see the base layer is the physical layer. So as we've just said, this is the mountains and the way that rivers and weather have shaped the land. We've got the biological layer, such as the vegetation, so it might be a bush next to a river or a forest. And finally, on top of there, we've got the human layer. So we can see a railway line, a bridge, some accommodation, a town centre or a city, and some road transport infrastructure too. On the right is our aerial photograph of a town in Wales, small town called Bedwas. And if you look in the background, you can see the physical layer. It's got hills. You can see the human layer here with some of the biological layer mixed in. So you've got the church, you've got houses, you've probably got businesses there too, maybe some buildings used for education. And again, some more biological layer with these tall trees and this beautiful green manicured lawn. How do landscapes change over time? So if we look at these two photographs, these were taken in Brimley Place in different time periods. This photograph here shows an industrial landscape next to the canal. These buildings would have been factories. Eventually, due to deindustrialisation, these factories closed down and this land became a derelict brownfield site. However, because this looked pretty miserable and pretty horrible, Birmingham regenerated this site and turned it into this multi-use area called Brimley Place. So you've got restaurants and bars, you've got this pleasant walkway next to the canal, you've got the pretty flowers on the bridge with big bright stainless steel handrails, and over the back you've got some accommodation and you have also got some offices. An important landscape in the UK that we're going to learn about is called the Lake District, and it's situated in Cumbria. Some interesting facts about the Lake District are that it's a spectacular mountain landscape in northern England, and it became a national park in 1951, which means it's very difficult to ever build anything on there because it's so beautiful. In 2017, it became a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and that is a site that is recognised globally for education, science, culture, and it's been inspiration to artists and writers many years over. In terms of tourism, 18 million people visit every year, and tourists spend £1.2 billion in the Lake District each year, so they're very heavily reliant on the economic opportunities provided by tourism. Just a bit of interesting information, I spent some of this money a few years ago when I got married to Mrs. Thicky. Weathering. How are landscapes changed by the weather? The first type of weathering is mechanical or physical weathering. This involves movement, and we use the example of freeze-fall weathering. So if you imagine, any cracks in rocks or landscape will be filled with water when it rains. At night time, when the temperature decreases below zero, the water will turn to ice and expand, weakening the rock. The next day, it will melt. This process of freezing water and thawing or melting water eventually causes the rocks to break away. And you can see this huge rock here that, if by magic, seems to have been split apart, but it's not. It's because of the process of freeze-fall weathering. The next example is chemical weathering. The most common way to think of this is acidic rain or acid rain, and this dissolves the calcium carbonate in rocks. But there are other things that cause chemical weathering, such as reactions with water. We've talked about reactions with acid, reaction with oxygen, or reaction with organisms. And this is why it's always important to clean the bird poo off your car, because if you don't, the chemicals in there will start to discolour it. That's a type of chemical weathering. If you look at this lovely gravestone here, you can see that chemical weathering has dissolved parts of it, dissolved the calcium carbonate, and we don't know what Henry's first name was, unfortunately. The final type is biological weathering. Biological is anything to do with plants and animals and how they wear away the landscape. Trees and roots are a good example. Their roots grow into the ground, get in the way into the cracks, and this will loosen the ground. If you ever walk down a pavement and you've seen a lump in the ground next to the tree, that is the roots doing biological weathering. Another example is animals, such as Mr. Badger. They burrow under the ground, same with foxes, and this creates weaknesses, and eventually the ground could potentially collapse. Moving on, river landscapes in the UK. The UK is super lucky in the way that it is full of freshwater rivers that transport water all around the United Kingdom. And the rivers play a big part in shaping the natural landscape. If we look at the features of a river drainage basin, which is simply an area that is drained by one particular river, we can see the river will start at its source. It will flow through its many different channels. When a smaller river joins a bigger river, we call them tributaries. And the point where a smaller river meets another river is called a confluence. And finally, the water will flow into the sea usually, or sometimes a lake, at its mouth. Another word that we need to be familiar with is the watershed, and this is basically an imaginary line that separates one river drainage basin from the next. River landforms of erosion. Rivers erode the land and create significant and also beautiful landforms. If we look at this photograph here of High Force on the River Tees, this huge waterfall has carved its way through the landscape, leaving a gorge behind it and this beautiful vertically descending waterfall. And on the right we have got interlocking spurs, but if you look closely you can see the river has wound its way, eroding as it goes, leaving these huge hills called spurs, interlocking a bit like a zip. Stages of waterfall formation are, it usually involves two layers of rock. The cap rock is more resistant, so it erodes slowly, whereas the rock below it is soft rock, so it's less resistant, it erodes quickly. The water erodes vertically via processes such as hydraulic action, eating away, eroding away the rock that is softer below it. Eventually this erosion continues until the cap rock or the overhang is unsupported and it crashes down into a plunge pool. And this process continues and continues, and the water will retreat upstream, leaving behind a steep-sided valley. The next is river landforms of erosion and deposition, and what we're looking at here is meanders and oxbow lakes. So if we look, this is the middle course of the river. You can see the valley is now much flatter, and if you look closely you can see the scars of where this river used to be as it's migrated laterally across the floodplain. Erosion and deposition and how oxbow lakes are formed. As a river moves around its bend, it will erode rapidly on the outer curve because this is where water is travelling fastest. So on the outer curve there, and there, water is eroding quickly, whereas on the inner curve, such as there, and there, the water is travelling slowly due to more friction, and this is going to cause deposition, which is when sediment is put down. Over time, this constant erosion creates a meander neck where the outside of the meanders get closer together, and during times of high river discharge, e.g. a flood, the river will break through, creating a new channel. Sediments such as silt and clay will be deposited at the side, and hey presto, we now have a new river channel and we have an oxbow lake. In the lower course of the river valley, you will also get some river landforms of deposition. Deposition is simply when material is placed down, and we can get these key features that we know called as levees. Levees is just French for rise, and as you can see, the embankments at the side of the river have risen up. How this happens is, during normal river conditions, any sediment that's transported in the river will be moving downstream to the mouth. However, during a flood, rivers water breaks its banks, larger sediment will be carried a long distance and deposited on the river banks, whereas smaller material will travel further. After time, this process continues and natural levees will build up either side of the river, and you have these big, rich, fertile floodplains. This actually forms a natural defence to river flooding because now the capacity of the river is higher. So, river flooding. A river flood is basically when the river discharge, which is the amount of water within the river channel, breaks its banks. Okay, because the river discharge rises, and the causes of river flooding can be split into human and physical. Physical causes of flooding are mainly linked to the shape of the land, so steep relief will increase surface runoff, but also heavy precipitation. In this photograph you can see large amounts of rainfall. You can also see that it's not infiltrating into the ground because the ground is saturated, and that may well be due to antecedent conditions, which basically means rainfall that's already happened. Human causes of flooding can be linked to increased amounts of urbanisation. In the UK, the percentage of people who live in towns and cities is really high, and this means that people have started to build on the floodplains. When we build settlements, we tend to use impermeable rocks such as concrete and tarmac, which increases surface runoff. This water is directed down to a drainage system and ends up straight into the river. This reduction in lag time leads to what you can see here, which is a devastating river flood. If we want to use an example of a river flood, we can use the Boscastle 2004 flood that is in the county of Cornwall, and as you can see, it had devastating impacts on this small village. The effects of this can be split into social, economic, environmental. If we start with the environmental, hundreds of trees were uprooted and swept into the river. Some of them actually got stuck under bridges, blocking the river channel, making the flood even worse because the carrying capacity of the river was reduced. Social impacts, many people were left without homes and possessions, and this would have left them psychologically scarred. And the economic impacts, well, most of Boscastle's income, 90%, comes from tourism. The flood forced a lot of these tourist facilities, think shops, hotels, to close, and also discouraged people from visiting the area because people may well have been worried that they would be involved in the next flood. The final part of this topic, we're going to be looking at coastal landscapes in the UK. If we have a look at the map here, we can see many key coastal towns and key coastal features around the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom coastline is shaped generally by waves. Waves are formed when wind blows over the surface of the sea, and the energy from the wind is transferred to the water, and then the waves crash onto the beach. When a wave moves up the beach, it's called swash. When gravity pulls it back down, it's called backwash. And waves are responsible for erosion, transportation and deposition along the coastline. There are 4 types of coastal erosion that we need to be aware of. The first one is called abrasion. Abrasion is like the sandpaper effect. Sediment in the sea is either scraped along the seabed or hurled at the base of the cliff, causing it to erode away. The next example we can use is attrition. Attrition is when sediment in the sea collides with each other, and as it bangs into each other, it breaks apart, getting smaller and rounder. The next example is to do with a chemical change, and it's called solution. Slightly acidic seawater dissolves rock, especially calcium carbonate, again making sediment smaller and rounder. And then finally, hydraulic action. The shear force of the wave traps air in cracks in the cliff. This is called cavitation, and over time the shear force of the water causes the cliffs to erode and collapse, and when a large section of cliff collapse, it is called mass movement. How is material transported in the sea? It's transported via transportation, and there are 4 key types of transportation. We'll start with the largest first. Large chunks of rock, think parts of cliff that have just collapsed, are rolled along the seabed. As these rocks get eroded, maybe through attrition and solution, they are small enough now not to float, but they can bounce, and we call the bouncing of stones along the seabed siltation. As these materials get broken down even further, they are now light enough to float, such as clay particles, and they're carried in the sea, and we call this solution. And finally, when these materials are completely dissolved, they are transported as a solution. Suspension, solution. Deposition is basically when the sea puts down material. It usually happens in low energy environments, and as a result, as you can see in this photograph, sand has been deposited at the base of this cliff, probably on top of a wave-cut platform, and formed this beautiful sandy beach. Landforms along the coastline. There are different types of landforms. This is an example of a landform of erosion, and we've also got some deposition. As you can see, we've got different types of rock. We've got this hard rock jutting out to sea, which is limestone, and this band of soft rock in between called clay. Over time, the sea would constantly be eroding. It would erode the headlands slowly, whereas it would erode the less resistant clay more rapidly, and that is why you've got headlands sticking out to sea and a bay formed in between them. And because of the low energy, the waves refract and deposit material on the beach. When a headland is jutting out to sea, this also goes through a process of erosion. Starts off that waves find weaknesses in the rock, and the headland then forms cracks. The continued erosion turns this crack into a cave. Over time, the waves continue to erode. Again, the wave refraction will bend around the headland, and also the impacts of subaerial processes such as weathering will also cause this arch to form as the headland's being cut through. These processes will continue until the top of the arch will collapse, leaving behind this tall chunk of rock called the stack. And finally, many years later, all these marine and subaerial weathering processes will erode the stack into a stump. Another key thing that I promise you will never forget is longshore drift. Longshore drift is a type of transportation that occurs along the coastline. Basically, prevailing wind blowing at an angle to the beach will cause the waves to approach the beach at an angle in its swash. However, because gravity pulls material down, the backwash goes back into the sea at 90 degrees. Swash, backwash, swash, backwash. Ultimately, material is dragged from one end of the beach to another end of the beach. If the coastline changes changes direction, for example here along the Holderness coast, longshore drift will continue, and it can lead to landforms of deposition such as this spit here. Material from eroded cliffs has been dragged down the coastline by a longshore drift. It has created this spit, and as you can see, it's developed a hook at the end, and this is probably because the wind direction would have changed. If we look behind the spit, we can see mud flats have started to form, and over time this would develop into a salt marsh. A natural habitat would be created, and eventually vegetation succession would take over, and this would create new land. Final thing we need to know about is managing the coastline. In this photograph, we can see some hard engineering. There is a huge concrete seawall that has been built, so when the wave energy hits the coastline, it is slowed down and reflected back into the sea. And we can also see some rock armour at the base of the cliff, with the idea that the waves hit the rock armour and the energy is reduced, again reducing impacts of erosion. In this example, we can see some soft engineering. Soft engineering is ecologically sensitive and it works with the environment. Sand is being dredged from the seabed and it's being pumped back onto the beach. This is called beach nourishment. It's recharging the beach, it's making the beach profile steeper, again reducing wave energy. It also makes a lovely feature that tourists like to go and visit. And while we're here, we can actually see a wooden grind, which is hard engineering, and this will stop the process of Longshore Drift and again help preserve the beach. So, now we've watched this video, you have got 3 homework tasks to come from. Task 1 is choose your favourite UK landscape and create a table that shows its physical, biological and human layers. That was towards the start of the video, you can go back and re-watch it. Next one, create an informative poster that shows different types of weathering, they're your subaerial processes, erosion and transportation, they're your marine processes. And finally, choose one or more of the landforms found along rivers and coastlines and create a beautiful storyboard showing their formation.